Hello, and welcome to our virtual Sierra Speaker Series, brought to you by the Sierra State Parks Foundation and California State Parks. My name is Denise Tran, and I'm the Events and Communications Manager for the Foundation. The Sierra Speaker Series shares and connects the rich cultural and natural history of the area to the community. Please donate to the Foundation today to support the interpretation, restoration, and preservation of our park system in the Lake Tahoe Donner area. Your tax-deductible donation will be kept locally and applied to priority projects. Please see our Facebook page for schedules of our upcoming talks and speakers. With me today is Judy DePuy. Judy is a retired engineer and marketer who enjoys sharing our local history. She has a degree from Stanford University and an MBA from Santa Clara University. After 35 years of working in high tech, she is now active in the Truckee Donner Historical and Railroad Societies and the Donner Summit Historical Society. She is on the board for the Museum of Truckee History. Judy writes regularly for the local publications and continues to be an advocate to keep Truckee's unique history alive. She is an active hiker, skier, gardener, and cook. She lives with her husband, Dave, and their dog Morticia in Tahoe Donner. Judy has spent many hours researching and fact-checking this presentation on the history of flumes. Thank you, Judy. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Denise, for that kind introduction. Again, I am Judy DePuy, and today we're going to talk about logging flumes, how the transporting of timber and lumber has changed over time, the exhilarating sport of flume riding, and finally, where to ride a flume today. Logging has been a part of Truckee history from the mid-1800s until the early 1900s. The early logging methods included a unique mixture of man and animals, including oxen, horses, and mules. These animals would move enormous, heavy logs from the hills to the and then to the railroad. This was very time-consuming, it was dangerous, and slow. The other issue was that the need for lumber was growing constantly. Lumber was needed to shore up the mother lode, where gold was found, the Comstock mines in Nevada, and building new towns in the West. So the trees to need. They looked at the old systems of dragging the wood, which wasn't working. To make this a profitable industry, they needed to come with an 1800 version of a high-tech system of moving the logs to the mills to so enter the flume. What are flumes? Flumes are a wooden water trough built on trestles or retaining walls to carry logs, lumber, and materials to milling points and railroads. Okay, what's a milling point? Milling points are simply sawmills located where the trees or timber are located. The mountain sawmills cut down the huge logs to usable lumber that could economically fit on the railroad. They finally solved the age-old problem of transporting these monstrous timber logs. Flumes used a combination of gravity and either flowing water or grease to move the logs. The log chutes and watercourse flumes were a natural choice to move the timber due to the close proximity of the logs to the river or natural springs, steep mountain slopes, abundant supply of water, and cost. Narrow gauge railroad cost around $4 per mile to build, where at this time it cost as little as $300 per mile to build a log chute. Plus, it only took 4 men and 4 oxen to lay a quarter mile of chute per day. Now, I'd mentioned that we also use grease to move the logs. What they would do is they would hire young men or boys, and they would go out onto the flume and literally grease the sides of the flume. And but the funny story is the fact that due to the lack of refrigeration here in Truckee, they would take the milk that was produced and they would turn it into butter. And they found out that they could butter the troughs, I mean the flumes, cheaper than having to buy lard. So what this means is that logs would go to a mill, be made into lumber or wood cords, which are used for burning, and then work their way to the railroad where they could go where they were needed. Flumes helped you to control wild streams and the issue of lack of water. Ponds could be built to keep water so that the flumes could run when they were needed. Additionally, flumes used no energy, created no pollution, and delivered water for irrigation at the end of the run as a byproduct. Here on this picture, you can actually see a feeder flume with water coming into the flume. Box flumes were thought to have been around since Roman times and were the basis of ancient aqueduct system. Roman flumes, however, carried large volumes of water at very slow speeds, not at all what we have in the Sierras. Again, flumes were more controllable than a wild stream where you had to worry about piling up of logs or water. And the flumes, again, allowed you to control the water flow. So these flumes throughout the Sierras were actual works of engineering spectacularness and history. The conventional box-shaped flumes have been used in this area since pioneer times, but they have the issue of the lumber boards wedging against the sides. These log jams were expensive, so they would have clearing points along the line for the boys to clear the jam. The loggers lived remotely in these clearing houses to keep the lumber moving down the flume. So enter V-flumes. V-flumes had been under development since the mid-1800s. J.W. Haynes is regarded as the inventor of. Haynes built the first V-flume, a 12-mile V-shaped trough down the east side of the Sierra to Carson Valley to serve the Comstock lode in Nevada in 1859. His V-flume overcame the problem of log jams. It was almost self-clearing, since if a jam started, the backhead, which is the buildup of water, lifted the planks into the widening top of the flume. California lumbermen copied Haynes's innovative transportation method, and flumes continued to evolve over time. V-flumes were also better in the fact that they used less timber to construct than the box flume and were much more efficient when using the water. V-flumes were constructed using rough planks around 1.25 to 1.5 inches thick and anywhere from 24 to 48 inches wide and 16 feet long. They were nailed together to make a 90-degree right angle, thus making a trough. They were laid on the ground using simple wooden props. They also had to build trestles when they had to cross difficult ravines. These V-flumes were watertight and could transport trees that were 40 feet long and massive amounts of bounded cords of lumber. Now from this, my graphic on the earlier slide, we were lucky enough to find a picture of an actual double flume construction. If you look at the picture, notice the V-flume on the top that has water running through it, and the box flume framework is underneath. In 1878, Sierra Nevada Wood and Lumber Company was founded. To supply lumber and water to Virginia City for the Comstock mines in the town, they used this two-flume method. The lumber company owned the V-flume on top and was fed water during the day for lumber delivery. The Virginia and Gold Hill Water Company owned the box flume on the bottom, and water was bypassed from the V-flume to the box flume at night to deliver drinking water to Virginia City. So a very efficient system. The building of the flume trestles were required due to the canyons and the ravines, and the fact that they needed to keep the grades reasonably even. And these trestles would also hug the walls of the very steep cliffs. And to show you how precarious it was to build the flumes, building the trestles was even more spectacular. Building a railroad trestle had very much different standards. The trains were heavy, so they had to be secure and not, collapse. Whereas the flume trestle construction, all it required was it had to be able to stand up and handle the weight of the water and the logs. Building it, though, did not mean it was an easy feat. And the goal was to build as much flume per day as possible. And here's another example of building a flume trestle, and this one is building it across a river. And again, the trestles were used to cross rivers many a time. The repair work on the flume was constant. These brave men would walk on catwalks that were only 6 to 8 inches wide, sometimes 100 feet in the air, on a trestle. The catwalk was a shallow step, and they had to bring all their tools they needed with them. During rainy or icy days and nights, many a flume walker would slip and meet their death. And hiring to work on these flumes required a test on how well you did at high elevations and heights. This job was not for the weak at heart. Now, the hub of everything and where the real work began was at the mill yard. The mills and mines were all wood-fired, and providing adequate cordwood for fuel was essential. These cordwood was used, because they had to run the saws and everything else to cut the lumber and to make additional cordwood. So the flumes brought the timber to the mill, and from here they could bundle cordwood, put it onto the flume, and put it to the rails. Now in this picture, it's kind of hard to see where the flume is, but if you look just below the building in the background, you'll see that's where all the lumber had come in on the flume to this mill. And again, what these men are working on is the finished product: usable lumber, cordwoods, and even shingles. And as mentioned earlier, they would run the cut finished wood down the flume in flume boats. This helped negating the cost of fluming the huge logs. And again, in this picture, you can see the men working along the flume to make sure the logs don't get jammed where they have bends in the flume. So let's do a quick change, and let's talk about the history of the V-flumes in our area. To put a more local face, this is the Truckee Lumber Company flume that goes through downtown Truckee to its mill in downtown Truckee. If you look on the back right-hand side, you'll see a white building, and that was C.F. McGlashan's mansion, just there on the top. But again, the flumes ran right through town, and they did the work in the milling in town. L. Allen came to Truckee in 1868 and owned the Truckee sawmill. He's said to have installed the first flume along Trout Creek from Tahoe Donner Bennett Flat Road to downtown Truckee. As learned from prior endeavors, Allen's V-flume went from his mill straight to the railroad. The mill boards slid on rollers onto the flume and weren't touched until they were taken out at Truckee for shipment on the rails. Again, a very efficient system that L. Allen put together. Water was scarce in Trout Creek in the late summer, and Allen had 2 large springs near his mill and used them for the flume. They would build a pond to store the water that was then used to haul logs down to the mill. In 1878, Allen's mill cut 700,000 board feet of lumber. At this point, flumes cost about $8,000 to $9,000 per mile, but they were considered the best flumes in the Sierra Nevada. Now, George Schaefer co-founded the first sawmill on the Truckee River, built and owned the first water system, and was a major booster of the civilized town of Truckee. Lumber would make George Schaefer a wealthy man by Truckee standards. He began building the first bridge over the Truckee River in 1867, allowing easy transportation from his mill to the railroad. Schaefer charged a toll for wagon and horse traffic, adding to his income for people using his bridge. Nevada County and Truckee residents decided that they needed to buy the bridge, and so they bought the bridge in 1873 due to the high cost of his toll. In the winter of 1868, Schaefer contracted with the Central Pacific Railroad to haul a small construction locomotive, the San Mateo, over the snow from Cisco to the plaza, what was about to become downtown Truckee. He disassembled it, loaded it onto sleds, and drove teams of snowshoe-plowed oxen over the drifts of Roller Pass. Once it was reassembled, Central Pacific used it to build a section of track along the Truckee River from Coburn Station down the Truckee River Canyon to the then Nevada state line. This was the island line, since it did not connect with any other rails, and was basically Schaefer's private rail. In addition to transporting lumber, flumes were used to carry passengers and supplies along the line, and it was quick transportation from one point to another. Seriously ill or injured patients would be strapped into the boats, and many times they would go down the flume with or without companions. These homemade flume boats were flat-bottomed, about 16 feet in length, and that was to add to the stability. Now, I'll note the gentleman here riding the flume boat is probably a U.S. Forest Service employee, since his hat marks him as an employee. Riding the flume also became a fun activity for families. It was easy transportation for the family to get from one point to another, and for entertainment. So you bring a picnic lunch, go through the forest, and at the end, take a horse and buggy up to where you started. Mrs. J.C. Forknor, daughter of a principal of Fresno Flume and Irrigation Company, recalls her dad organizing flume party rides with 6 to 8 people on a boat when the Clovis flume was brand new. They rode 15 miles to the saddle, had lunch, and then took a wagon back. Very civilized Sunday afternoon activity. And then there is the incredible sport of flume riding. The explosiveness from the speed and weight of the logs coming down the flume created some spectacular entries into the lake or river. It was from these magnificent exploits that the exhilarating and terrifying sport of flume riding was born. The sport of flume riding gained popularity in 1865 to 1895. Logger boats would be used to fly off the flume's endpoint at a monstrous height and speed into a lake. Passengers needed to eject from the logboat before it hit the water. The goal was to be safe and very far away from where the logboat would land, lest the logboat end up on top of you. Loggers used the flumes to get to town faster for one of their few nights off. Speed was a necessity to get to Truckee with its plethora of bars, numerous brothels, and one jail, built in 1875. These were all on Jaboom Street in Old Town Truckee. Loggers would build small boats that fit the flume of their specific logging town or mill. The V-flumes in Verdi, Crystal Peak, Dog Creek, and Prosser Creek were called Go Devils. The men at Banner Mill on Prosser Creek rode the Go Devils on payday nights, eager to be out of the pine forest, down to the railroad, which they rode to reach Truckee's nightlife. And again, note, the logging towns were dry towns. So after so many days of hard manual labor, a bit of escapism was a good thing. Obviously, it was hard to take photos of the flume races and rides. but many a newspaper person would capture the moment for the rest of the world to enjoy. One of the best stories of flume riding comes from the Tales of the Golden West article entitled "Journalist Would Never Forget Ride Down Comstock Flume" by Joe Smith. In this article, he wrote, in 1875, the Tribune sent H.J. Ramsdale west to research the newfound wealth in the Comstock. He was well entertained and escorted in style through mines and the 15-mile-long V-shaped flume where the massive logs came from the Sierras. These logs came down at incredible speed to the mill pond at Huppackers in the valley below Mount Rose. Ramsdale was offered to ride the flume, which he accepted on the condition that his hosts join him. It should be noted his hosts were James C. Fair and James Flood, major owners of Comstock's properties. They rode in hollowed out logs, the reporter and one of his hosts in the first, and the other host and a logger for ballast in the second flume boat. Ramsdale wrote, "The terror of that ride can never be blotted from my memory." He recalled hanging in midair with no visible support while the mountains rushed by. He admitted to being scared beyond all belief. The second dugout flume boat started 60 seconds after the first, caught up to it just as they reached the mill pond. There was so little understanding of what it was like in the Wild West, but the collision of the two boats sent all four flume riders sailing in different directions, far from shore. Ramsdale admitted he'd had enough with flumes, but when asked why he did it, he said, "Well, I figured if men worth $25 million apiece could risk their lives, I could too." But not to take away from the excitement of the flumes, but the introduction of the narrow gauge railroads made flumes less popular and less necessary for logging. And these railroads may have saved a few lives. Narrow gauge was economical since they could be put in quickly and were easy to move to where the next felling of logs were found. These rails made it easier to get the logs to the various mills, which would make the lumber, shingles, wood for burning, and more. And again, they would deliver the products to the main railroad, to the Transcontinental, for delivery across the country. I like this photo in the fact that it's amazing to see how close they would take the logs to the narrow gauge railroad. And here you can see how the narrow gauge railroad, winds its way through the mountains. But again, it's where the next stand of trees were, so that they could quickly get it down to where it was needed to the mill and then to the rail. In 1884, Hobart Mills off of Highway 89 here outside Truckee was established. And in 1886, a standard gauge railroad was built from Truckee to Hobart Mills. Shortly after the sawmill was completed, narrow gauge lines ran through the woods like a spider's web. So they had the narrow gauge lines going to wherever there was still stands of trees. And so they would be able to log it and put it down and bring it down to the standard gauge railroad. And they continued these operations until 1936, when the virgin timber stands were depleted and all the mills were closed. And again, this is an example of how precarious it was for not only flumes, but the narrow gauge rails, because the narrow gauge rails had to worry about weight. And many a narrow gauge train would derail or crash into another train as they ran out of control. Since the slopes were still fairly steep, they were windy, and the trains were heavy. At the time, what they had to do was they had to get across the granite and the steep troughs and the canyons. So again, there were accidents, but it was still an efficient way to harvest the logs. The Truckee Donner Railroad Society has led tours, trestle tours, where you can see remnants of the old flumes and of the trestles all throughout the hills. It's a great tour But if you go on it, I highly recommend a four-wheel drive car, a good four-wheel drive car, because the roads are not that well maintained. Again, here are some more remnants of flumes that are found in the hills and part of the Truckee Donner Railroad Society trestle tour. And another way you can see flumes, and it's a lot easier, as you drive from Truckee to Reno, you'll see on the right-hand side flumes that look like they must be carrying water or something. Well, these basically are hydroelectric flumes, and they are still in use today. As early as these flumes were built in 1899, when they realized that they needed renewable, cheap energy. Some things never change. So again, you can see some of the abandoned flumes. They were abandoned around Farad due to flooding. But the flumes from Florestan down to Verdi are still active. And you can actually see where the excess water is dropped off as the other water goes into the hydroelectric power plant. And the only reason it was easy to build these flumes because all you needed was a head, which is water has to drop 100 feet to get the required power to run the turbines. And so again, this flume water powered the early mills before the onset of steam. And with this photo, you can see that repairing the flumes always constantly needed. And here is, we took a photo in the winter where the water is leaking, and they actually repaired or replaced this section of flume a year or so later. And lastly, flume rides are still available today, but they're a little more safe. You can go to the amusement parks, but they try to still keep the pioneering spirit and the excitement of being on a flume boat and steep slope and splashing into your lake or river. So thank you so much. If you need additional information, you can always, or you have questions, you can always send me an email, or you can go to our websites. And I'll pass it back to you, Denise.
Wow, so much of this information was new to me. I wonder how many of you would ride a flume? Leave a comment if you would or wouldn't. Judy, would you ride a flume?
Only the slow-moving flumes with a picnic lunch.
Yeah, I would probably only do like the Disney one. Judy, thank you so much for organizing and presenting on this lesser-known facet of Truckee history. This concludes our Sierra Speaker Series and series for the year. We already have some exciting topics lined up for 2021. Stay involved with us to learn more. This interpretive presentation has been brought to you by the Sierra State Parks Foundation and California State Parks. Please donate to Sierra State Parks Foundation to support interpretation, preservation, and restoration of our park system in Lake Tahoe Donner area. Your tax-deductible donation will be kept locally and applied to priority projects. Thank you so much, and we'll see you online next time. Judy will stay on to answer any additional questions, and you can also email her at judy.depuy@gmail.com. Thanks, everybody. Bye.